All right, well, good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. We're really honored you're here on this Tuesday afternoon. My name is Michelle. I'm honored to be able to be here with you all. I'm joining from Edmonton, Misquitchie, Wahkotowin, Treaty 6 territory. We got snow. I feel like that season, this winter season is here, and it's good. It's good. So wherever you're joining from, just taking a moment, pressing pause to acknowledge the land in which you live on, acknowledge those who've walked before us, acknowledging most importantly, Creator. When that sun rose in the east, that was Creator meeting us for another day. And so we give thanks to Creator for this day, for this moment, this virtual community that you have joined. Cando's Links to Learning. We are here every Tuesday, and we cover a variety of topics. We're particularly excited about today. Before we get started, though, I want to make a couple of announcements. One of them is at the end of today's presentation, you will be sent an evaluation link, and we would love to hear your feedback, what you thought about today's presentation. And when you send that in, your name will be entered to win a Visa gift card. So we'd love to hear from you. And then there will be an opportunity for any questions, comments at the end of today's presentation. So please bring them to the table. You can also write them in the chat box throughout. If you're anything like me, I have a short memory. So you can put them in the chat box, and I'll make sure that we will tend to them at the end of today's presentation. So we're honored and happy that you have joined us. I am super excited about today's session. It is Indigenous Law and Economic Development. So what is Indigenous Law, and how can we support Indigenous communities in advancing economic development and revitalize Indigenous laws? Love, love, love it. I'm here for it. All right, so today's guest speaker, we are so honored that you are here. Koren Lightning-Earle is a legal counsel at Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge at the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. She engages with Indigenous community through community-led research, which is so vital, so important to have that community engagement and voice. The Lodge supports Indigenous communities' goals to identify, articulate, and implement their own laws and governance. So we're so honored, Koren, that you are here, that you are lending your powerful voice to this topic. And we're really honored to hear about what you are doing and what you're going to share with us today. So we welcome you, and the virtual mic is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. So again, that was a great introduction. So yes, I'm a lawyer and I work at Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge. So I have a presentation, but before I get into that, I just want to share a video with you about where I work and about the essence of Wahkotowin and why we call it Wahkotowin Lodge. And it speaks to the way that we do our work and when we're working with communities in revitalizing Indigenous laws. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll have a 3-minute video. Here we go.
Tanse. My name is Matthew Wildcat. I'm a research fellow at the Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge and assistant professor at the University of Alberta. I'm also a member of Ermiskin Cree Nation. We're out here today on Ermiskin Cree Nation Reserve in my parents' yard where I grew up. The Wahkotowin Lodge was created as a partnership between the faculties of Native Studies and Law in 2018. The motto of the Lodge is upholding Indigenous law and governance, and I wanted to come out here today to the place where I first began to learn about those concepts. What I want to talk about right now is the connection between Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous law and governance. Sovereignty is one of those big $50 words that people like to throw around. It's really hard to define. I think that's a good thing. Being able to discuss and debate, agree and disagree, these are all sovereign practices. One of the other ways we can talk about Indigenous sovereignty is through its spiritual basis. We might say that sovereignty is something the Creator has given to us. We don't own it or we don't control it. But we still have a responsibility to nurture it, to give life, and to breathe energy into our sovereignties. One of the ways we do this, the main way we do this, is through the relationships that we maintain with each other at the family level, but also within and between communities and nations, and through our relationships with the natural world. But when we talk about sovereignty, I also think we need to talk about colonialism. Colonialism has impacted our relationships that we can have with each other and Indigenous nations, and it's undermined the way in which we can make collective decisions. I think we should feel free to admit that colonialism has damaged our legal and political systems without the fear that this undermines our sovereignties. The reason here is important. While sovereignty is connected to law and governance, they're not the same things. Our sovereignties are bigger than ourselves. It's something that's been given to us. And as such, someone can't simply take it away. If sovereignty is the spirit and the philosophy that makes us independent, law and governance are the tools or the vehicles through which we realize our sovereignty on the ground. Discussing the challenges facing our legal and political systems doesn't undermine our sovereignty. It gives us the greatest chance to realize our sovereignties to the fullest extent. The Wahkotowin Lodge exists to uphold Indigenous law and governance. This is incredibly difficult work, but we need to build systems that we can be proud of, not just some of the time, but most of the time. The Lodge is a center for research and training that brings people together to learn and to grow in the face of our most pressing challenges. It exists to support communities to identify, articulate, and implement their own goals around law and governance. And finally, it exists as a space to bring people together, our best minds and our most experienced people who can discuss, debate, and communicate about how we uphold Indigenous law and governance. This takes the work of many, academics, community leaders, elders, students, and youth. We're very privileged to be undertaking this work with all of you together.
Koren, oh, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. So that is Matthew Wildcat. He's a research fellow with the Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge. We're very happy at the Lodge to be able to have access to such great academics that are doing really good work. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do at the Lodge and how we do research and work with communities to revitalize their laws, and how does that relate to economic development. When we think about economic development, I teach business law, and I teach a lot of business law courses, but when I'm working with Indigenous communities and teaching Indigenous students, I try to go back to when we're thinking about how we're going to develop communities, going back to our structures and who we were prior to colonialism and building up from there, and really taking that time to go back to where we were to help that sovereignty, because our economic development does provide us with the tools and with the fuel to be able to kind of create our communities and bring our communities forward in that support. So I'm an Indigenous lawyer. Surprise! I'm from Samson, Cree Nation. I've been practicing law for over 10 years. Before I was a politician for 3 years. I was a politician and a lawyer. Then I decided that was too much, so I just went back to being a lawyer because there's less drama. And I started my own practice, which is Thunderbird Law. And then I've been doing a lot of work in the area of cultural awareness, building relationships, and unconscious bias training with different communities. I worked for Law Study of Alberta for 2 years as their Indigenous Initiatives Liaison, in developing the cultural awareness training that they are now offering to all lawyers. And then I work at the Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge, which is at the University of Alberta. And so working there has been something that it's been really important to me. So I was raised in a Cree community. My father is late Walter Lightning and Emma Lightning raised me, and my other father is Rick Lightning and Inez Lightning. So I'm very fortunate that I was raised with many parents. I guess I was a handful, so Creator decided that there needed to be a lot of people in my life to make sure that I succeeded. And so I was always raised in the value of having to live my life by Cree law. So I walk in two worlds. In essence, I follow Western Canadian law, well, because I don't want to go to jail. But I also, first and foremost, follow, for me, Cree law, in terms of that I leading my life in a way that is important to me as a Cree female and wanting to raise my children in a Cree way and following those laws first and foremost. And every now and then those laws sometimes come into clash. For example, when I swear oaths, I don't swear my oath on a Bible, and I don't affirm. I swear my oaths on eagle feather and sweetgrass, because for me that is legal to me. And now, fortunately, it is now legal in Canada, well, in Alberta, able to swear oaths on eagle feathers. And so I'm constantly figuring out ways. The reason I went to law school was because I didn't have lifelong dreams of wanting to become a lawyer. That wasn't, I think I was supposed to be like an actor, supposed to audition for New York, but I couldn't read music, so I didn't get in. So the next obvious thing is to become a lawyer if I can't be an actor. It's kind of the same. We act in the courtroom. And so when I went into law school, it's like it's like learning a different world. It's like, I always call it aliens. I'm like, you know what the alien said today when I'm talking with other Indigenous lawyers? Because we feel like we're in a different world of learning a different world reality of just how some people's worlds work. And learning a different essence of law. Coming from being raised on 4 Mile in Samson Cree Nation, we didn't have a lot of fences, and the issues of individual ownership of property wasn't something that made sense to me. I came up with the values of Wahkotowin, that everything is related and that we all work together and we take care of each other. And so going into law school, learning about things that are very individual and individual rights, it was a lot. And so learning Western law, and I am a called lawyer, so I am legally able to give legal advice, because I pay the law society lots of money every year to be able to do that. I learned law so that I could support my communities in their growth. My goals has always been to support my communities in whatever it was. It started out as teaching phys ed when I first graduated university, and then continuing to move forward. And so I've always been embedded in wanting to advance my community's rights. And so when I use law as a tool. It's a tool that I have in my toolbox to be able to advance communities in their needs and in their how they can get sovereignty and how work better to better their nations. So I know what the Western law needs. I know all of their rules. I know all of that, and I just use that to better my nations. And so it's really just using that to advance mine. So just getting their playbook in how I move forward. And so that's kind of how I practice law, and really helping communities realize that on their own too. So the way that we practice law, it's not, if someone wants me to go develop a law for them, there's a lot of background information that I have. I don't say, okay, here's a copy of a law. It's usually having a lot of conversations with elders, with knowledge keepers, with leadership, and with people right in the community that those laws are going to affect. And how can we I always get people to think back and expand our minds to how this would have been prior to colonialism. We had laws and we had ways of being that even dealt with trade and economic diversity. It just didn't look like what we think it looks like now. So we had rules. We didn't just run amok as people may have thought. We were very sovereign beings. So the Wahkotowin Lodge, our principles are, as you heard in the video, to identify and articulate and help communities implement their own laws and governments, because we know they already have those laws. They already have that wisdom. They're the knowledge holders. They're the experts in their own community's goals and their own community's traditions and values. And so we're there to facilitate and help gather and amplify, using some of our research methods and tools, able to revitalize those laws so the community can move forward. So we just come in for a short-term basis, sometimes long-term if they really like us, and then support them in really building them up so that they recognize their own awesomeness. And then we produce useful and accessible practical governance resources and public legal education in ways that where we see there's a lot of need in that area. And so our lodge was created out of the TRC calls to action, which is number 50, which is for the creation of Indigenous Law Institutes for the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous law. So we were created directly out of that call to action, and we're funded by the Alberta Law Foundation and Justice Canada. And yeah, if you know someone that wants to give some money, we'll also take that. So we go along the principles of Wahkotowin and Wahkotowin as legal principles, and it governs how we work with communities, it governs our relationships, and it guides the principles in the work that we do when we're working with Indigenous communities. Indigenous law and Aboriginal law are not necessarily the same. So sometimes when people say, well, I practice Aboriginal law, I would say that I practice both. I can practice and uphold Indigenous law, and I can practice Aboriginal law. Aboriginal law is judge-made law. So it's those laws that created the free and prior informed consent, that created how we decide land title, how we decide Aboriginal rights. So it's those judge-made laws. So it's those cases. It's Belgamook, it's Sparrow, it's Gladue, it's all of those cases that have been gone through the courts, and that's judge-made law. So that's Aboriginal law. So if someone tells you they practice Aboriginal law, they're the ones that are in the courts doing that type of work, and which is good work, and we need people to do that. And it's Aboriginal law, and then there's Aboriginal peoples in the Crown. Whereas Indigenous law is rooted in Indigenous societies, and it's Indigenous legal orders. It's those laws that tell me how to raise my children. It's those laws and principles and values that are about kinship and Wahkotowin. It's laws around how we take care of animals when we are hunting, how we don't overhunt. It's laws about how we take care of ourselves and our bodies, and how we interact with each other and other nations. Indigenous societies have always had laws. They've had ways of being. We were societies. And if you think about your own communities, we know that. We know that they had societies, we just didn't have this written book that currently now people are used to. And Indigenous law doesn't have to look like Western laws. It doesn't have to look like that. Sometimes we think, I was working on a constitution and they're like, well, our constitution should look like the Canadian Constitution. Like, it doesn't have to. Your law can look like whatever it looks like that means and resonates with you. If your law looks like a pipe, then let's do that. Like, let's make that so that nobody can come in and say anything about that. And so how can we do this, support that? And so Indigenous laws, they've been practiced and they've been passed down through our elders, our families, our clans, and our bodies within Indigenous societies, in those houses. Indigenous laws, they continue to be recorded and promulgated in various forms, including stories, songs, practices, and customs. And that's a quote from John Burroughs, who is a highly sought after academic who really is sort of our mentor when it comes to working with Indigenous laws and communities. A lot of the grounding principles around Indigenous laws is that Indigenous laws are laws. They are laws and need to be treated seriously and as laws. They're not less than Canadian law. They're not, if anything, sometimes I would say they're more than Canadian law. But Indigenous law research, when we're looking for those laws, it's conducted with the highest standards of rigor and transparency. So we really make sure we have really high standards when we go into communities, when we're going to do research and support them to get those laws. And Indigenous laws are just one aspect of Indigenous governments as part of a comprehensive whole. And revitalizing Indigenous laws and governance process are essential for rebuilding healthy communities and, again, for reconciliation. But it's also essential in terms of when we think about how we're going to move forward in economic development. How does that relate to us? How would we have, if we were even developing And this is maybe my next goal. So if there's a community that wants to partner with us, that wants to develop like a business license program, how would we do that? Or a fish and wildlife law, how would we do that? How would we create laws around economy in our communities? Where would we start? Where would we begin? Well, we would begin with going back to what are the principles and values around economy, because we did. There's cases and Vanderpeet and Sparrow and that were talked about societies and how they traded and fished and all of these different things. We practiced building our economies. We practiced business. We did those things. It just didn't look like what they're used to seeing. It may not have been a cash register, but there was an exchange of goods and services. So Indigenous laws, we always think about, I work with Hadley Friedland, and she did her PhD with Val Napoleon, and she talks a lot about Indigenous laws. And I like the idea when she talks about this roots to Renaissance and the 4 eras of Indigenous laws. So we think about 1,000+ years ago. So that's like before there was people, before there was these colonialism, there was law. Like we had ways. We had ways of even interacting. I once had somebody ask me, well, did you have laws of diplomacy? And I'm like, of course we had laws of diplomacy. It's not like we just lived in a bubble and didn't interact with other Indigenous nations. Yes, we had laws of diplomacy. It just looks different. And sometimes when we have this Western colonial mindset, if it doesn't look like theirs, then it's not real or it's less than. But it was there. We had laws. And you can see many communities have very much documented through their oral history, through their clans, through many things, through their stories. And so then about for 100 to 400 years, we had that repression and resilience. So that's when colonialism started, when the settlers came over, when we were put into reserves, when residential schools started, when Indian Act was created. There was that repression. It was no, your laws don't look like our laws. You are not people. You are less than. We are going to make you small. And that's what happened. And then we see about 10 to 40 years ago, we started to see that recovery and that revitalization, because we were actually allowed to be humans in Canada. We were allowed to vote finally in the 60s. We were allowed to go to university without having the fear of losing our status. And so we were even able to hire lawyers, because before that, even if we knew we were being wronged by Canada, it was very difficult. And there is points in history where people did hire lawyers, or lawyers worked for Indigenous nations pro bono for free. But yeah, it wasn't until about 10 to 40 years ago, we started recovering, saying, no, now we're going to do this. Now we're done this repression stage. And now within the last 1 to 10 years, we see this resurgence and this renaissance, as you call it, where people are engaging with Indigenous laws as laws. About 15 to 20 years ago, if I were to be talking about Indigenous laws in class where I was talking, I'm like, no, we have laws around objects, around sacred objects, and those laws should trump personal property laws. Like when we think about peace pipes and when people pawn those, whose law should be trumped? Provincial law says the person that pawned it owns it, they have the right to sell it and all these things. But we know that in our communities, that's not the law. You don't have the right to sell it. You don't have the right to do all of these things. And so then it was very difficult. Now I could probably create a case and create a community law around that to kind of defend those sort of sacred objects. And now we even see laws where sacred objects are being repatriated with communities from museums. And so we're starting to see a lot of that resurgence. So what are Indigenous laws? So they're not Aboriginal laws. So they're not state laws applied to Aboriginal people. They're not restorative justice. It's not Aboriginal courts, not healing programs. Indigenous laws can be ancient, they can be deeply rooted, sourced in the sacred or the earth. We have laws around berries. We have laws in the trees. They could be recent, drafted, such as treaties, agreements, bylaws, or legislation. We have a lot of advanced Indigenous nations that are very advanced in their lawmaking ability. And they can have elements of both legal traditions and other sources of law. Indigenous laws, their deliberation and debate, they're not declarations. It's not shouting from the rooftop, but there are reasons and principles and values behind their laws. There's principles and processes, not positions. It's not, there's a reason why certain things happen, the reason why those things. And we always think, well, I was just told not to do this, but there's reasons why we were told X and Y. There's reasons why, and there's stories and reasons why in between those ones. Indigenous laws can be used in implicit or informal ways, and sometimes they can even be damaged and unevenly misunderstood and mistrusted. And sometimes people misinterpret them. And as we move forward in our advancing things, we misinterpret them, or they might be adapted, and they can be shared in ways that are not familiar to legal professionals. Explaining Indigenous laws to lawyers is very difficult. It's way easier to explain it to people from communities, but explaining it to lawyers, which is what I do on a daily basis, is always more of a challenge. And Indigenous laws are rarely recognized, resourced, and enforced adequately, unfortunately. Indigenous laws in the courts. So there was a case, we're starting to see them now. And the reason we're starting to see Indigenous laws being talked about in the courts is because we have a huge number of Indigenous lawyers going into law school, graduating, getting called to the bar, practicing, and fighting for their own communities and fighting for other communities in the courts. Just this past week, we had, many of my friends were all dressed up in their robes to present to the Supreme Court all across Canada via WebEx, fighting for, I think it was Blueberry River's case. But yeah, they're bringing in their own laws now. They're saying, no, Canada, this is not the law. These are our laws. These are what we're doing. And so there's Terry Lynn Williamson Davidson is a lawyer from BC, and she's very passionate about Indigenous laws and the work she does on the West Coast. And so she went to the Supreme Court for the Haida case, and she was arguing with well, that's what it is, we argue, but no, like argue, but making her statement to the court. And she argued to get the court heard in the community, but they wouldn't have the court in the community. So she said, okay, I'm going to bring it to you. And so they blew up a huge picture of the trees. And the trees in BC are big. I just got back from there. And they're huge. And so they blew up this huge picture, and she put it up behind her as a backdrop as she was presenting her case to the court. And she said, you wouldn't come to my community, so I brought my family to you. So do you see these trees behind me in this photo? These are our sisters. These are our family. This is who we're fighting for. We're fighting for them. We have a responsibility to them. I have a legal responsibility to these trees. And she brought that into the court, and nobody else would have done that, because it's not something that you would normally know unless you were from those communities or you were doing this work. But as a way to bring in Indigenous law into the courts. And I always think about that and how important it is to do that. I just did training with 100 Ontario judges last week and about 100 in Alberta about Indigenous laws and how the courts need to recognize there's more than just common law and civil law in Canada. There is Indigenous law. We really need to just rewrite the Constitution and make my life easier. But Indigenous legal in Denetah First Nation, Justice Gramont writes that Indigenous legal traditions are among Canada's legal traditions, and they form a part of the law of the land. And so there was a few cases. There was a case, a really old case. It's called Connolly and Woolrich. And so it was from 1867, and it was a case of marriage. And a man married an Indigenous woman in the Indigenous way. They had a traditional ceremony, and then he decided about a year or two later, okay, I'm done. I'm gonna go legal. I'm gonna go marry another woman, and I'm gonna go marry another woman. And so he married a non-Indigenous woman, and tried to marry her. But his first spouse took him to court and said, no, you can't be married to someone else. You're legally married to me. And so it was the first time that an Indigenous traditional ceremony was brought into the court and was decided it was legal. And that's when we started to see these Indigenous concepts being brought to the court. So Canadian courts have always recognized the existence of Indigenous legal traditions, but they've not given effect to the situations created by Indigenous law. So we're really starting to see that. And it's really important too, as we begin to develop legislation and things, especially when we see like the ideas around cannabis and tobacco and gaming, and communities that are wanting to develop their own laws around that. And there's been cases that have gone through the courts around gaming that didn't unfortunately get decided in the community's favor, but that doesn't mean that that's the end all be all. It just means you just need to take a different approach. And so there's ways to be able to kind of look at what is needed for economic development and what governance structures and what legal structures do we need to create in our communities to advance those, to have those, to ensure that it's for the best of the community and it's for and by the community. So Indigenous laws in Canada today, they are a part of Canadian law. They're there. We just have to kind of like etch them out and remind people that they exist, remind them that we're still here and we didn't get wiped out. And courts are increasingly being called to be engaged with Indigenous laws from a range of sources. Many judges are learning more about Indigenous laws. We have Indigenous judges that are bringing it in. They're learning that Indigenous laws come in various forms, some that might look familiar to the court and some less familiar. The Canadian legal profession and judiciary are starting to need strategies and competencies for how to engage. And I think this also would go with, when we think about the business community, is how do we start to get the business community start to see how we do business according to our ways and according to our legal principles and values around commerce and trade. So there's many sources of Indigenous laws, and there's been a lot of work done by a lot of academics. There's law in language. We can see law in the land. We have law in ceremony. We can find sources of law in implicit and informal practices. And then we also have in our stories and our oral history, which are very, very common. We see Dalgamuk, much of the case in Samson versus the Queen. It was a lot of oral history that was being presented, but the courts just didn't know how to engage with it then. They knew it was there, but they're like, we're used to laws being written. How is this law by an elder telling us their testimony? How is that a law? Well, that's how it looks like to us. And so it's just about getting people to start to see our laws as different ways. So at the Lodge, we have a couple approaches when we're working with communities to advance their laws. We've done work around membership. We've done work around child welfare. We're doing some work around constitutions. We love doing work around community strategic planning and how are we going to help the community, what's next for the community to advance them. And so we, again, create accessible public legal education resources. We do presentations to communities and various groups. And it's really important for us to have public legal resources that people they can understand. You should be able to read something and not have to hire a lawyer to tell you how it is. It should just be accessible. We do a lot of judicial education and legal education. We curate and we amplify wise practices. So if there's communities that are doing amazing things, how can we link them up with other communities? How can we support them? How can they be a leader to other communities? How can we amplify those voices? and we make connections. We do one-on-one coaching and advising to support communities that are doing the work. So this morning we just had a meeting with the community. They're like, we know we want to do something. We're like, okay, here's some ideas of how we can help you. Maybe you want to take our research program, our research methods workshop, and that'll help you get someone trained. Or maybe you just need a presentation to your community. We have a couple other things. And then we do these major community-led research projects that are specific work by particular nations and time, and it's very labor intensive. So we started with this summer, we had 3 communities that we were working with, and we hired legal researchers and community researchers. So our community research is community-led. We don't go in and tell the community what they need. Communities come in and tell us what they need, and we listen, and then we're there to support and uphold them. And how can we best support them? We identify their strengths and build on those strengths that they have. We provide training and support to community leaders and workers, because we don't want to be an extraction agency. And sometimes we see businesses and development companies come in and they want to just come in and extract, come in and take away. And we don't want to do that. We want to come in and build. We want to build. We want to like plant little trees of people and support and learning and education, because we find that's what we need in communities, just to come in and support them. We apply various methods. We have a narrative analysis method, a linguistic method, kinship visiting method that we apply to the research that we do in working communities. And we engage the whole community. We believe everybody has wisdom, and we need everybody's wisdom for the wisest result. And so we did a community workshop a while ago with Cold Lake First Nation, and it's weird. We talked with, they're talking with everybody, who everybody has value, everybody from the little ones all the way to the old ones, and developing again clear language, governance, and legal resources for them. And this could start to include even economic development resources. How we have research partnership agreements that we do with communities, and that's to ensure that everybody knows that the information that we're creating and anything we're developing, it's owned by the community. They own the intellectual property. Again, we're just there to help build. We're not, and they get to own it, and it's theirs to share as they will. And then we get, if they give us permission, then we get to tell people about how awesome they are. We hire legal researchers from the law school, and then we hire community research from the community. And however, because we really believe that community researchers are key when we're working with communities. They're that link into the community. They love their community. They know who is the best. If we were to say who would be the best to talk about the laws around the traditional laws around hunting and trapping, or laws around marriage and kinship, that person would know which elder we should go talk to. And so they're really that link. And so, and we train them up, and we try to convince them to maybe come to law school if they want to, but really just working with them. And then we offer Indigenous research methods for revitalizing laws and governance training course. We had a 2-week course in the summer. We'll probably offer another 2-week course in the summer of 2022. We're offering a mini course sometime this December around the research engagement process, just so people can get a taste of what we offer. So that, because there are a lot of communities that want to start developing their laws and governance, so they'll take our training, and then they'll be able to, hopefully we can support them along the way while they're doing that. And our research process is, we have a specific process that we do. We find it provides the best results for communities. We do inventory strengths and resources, and really finding out what communities have. A lot of communities have so much knowledge and wealth, and so we just gather it all into a report for them, so they're easy to find it. We identify and select which method we're going to use in our research, create goals with the community on what their goals are, create some timelines. We implement a research plan of how we're going to go forth, and that research plan might look, it's built by the community in terms of what is the end goal of the community, what are they wanting to create, and so it would be built around that, and it could look very different for a lot of communities. And then we go through an analysis, a legal analysis, and a final report. And then sometimes if there's next steps like legal drafting, like if somebody were to want to create a law, they say they want to develop a law around business licensing or setting up businesses in a community or something like that, we could do all the research around that and support communities on how to do that research. And then the next steps is if they need legislative drafting, that's another possible partnership, or we could help them with giving directions to legal counsel to say, here's what you would say to your legal counsel. This is how you want to develop. Because a lot of times we see, like with some laws, we see that they're the same from community to community. And it's just because sometimes some firms will take a law and it's really good, so then they just push to the next community, which is really good, but you really need to take the time to tweak it so that it's individual for that community, so that it speaks to that community. Because at the end of the day, if all the communities are taking their same business development bylaw to the courts and it all looks the same and it doesn't resonate individually with them, then we haven't really done too much of anything advancing our communities. Some of the challenges that we have, again, is we've had such a long state of repression. There's sometimes unevenness. Being able to have accessibility, and how can we create something? Again, people still don't think Indigenous laws are laws. Unenforceability. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we create laws that are enforceable or programs that are enforceable? Lack of funding. Not a lot of people have laws to develop, have funds to develop legislation around anything. We're in pandemic and there's lots of other things going on that we need to really turn our minds to. And then educational gaps within communities and between communities too. In practice, we use multiple methods together. We just did one community, we've used the relational, we used kinship visiting as part of our research, and then we use the story-based methods. So we looked at what stories they had around certain things. Because a lot of times if we listen to stories that communities have, we'll start to see that stories have we can draw out the principles and values around whatever it is we're looking for. So for example, if we were going in to talk about a child welfare project, we would say, okay, let's collect Cree stories or Dene stories that involve children or orphans. And then you start to see and then we have a way of breaking them down and looking at them, and we case brief them and really draw out those principles. Then we have you can do land-based learning, ceremonial practices, linguistic methods. We created language bundles. So yeah, it just really depends on the needs of the community, and we figure out which method would work best. And then sometimes use a couple of methods. Giving back to community, that's one of the main goals that we do, and it does increase the community's capacity. We really believe in capacity building for communities, because if they can do our method and work with us in one way, then they should be able to go forward and do it in many other ways. Training, so ongoing coaching and advising. We create a final report for them, and maybe that final report will help them to access funds for certain things, whatever it may be, whatever it is that they need to move forward. And again, possible drafting legislation or drafting instructions for lawyers. And then we're able to have community written or co-written publications, and also video resources. As you can see, the one video that we created that I showed you in the beginning, and we're working on creating a couple more videos with communities. So when I think about how could that relate to, as we move all of our pillars up for Indigenous communities, it advances all of our pillars. And as we create strong governance and legislative bases, it gives way to allow the development of business and economic in the community. And also economic and business development does allow, it kind of funds that legal development too. It creates that cash opportunity, which I find is really helpful with some communities. And by building capacity, it does build capacity within the nation to get people trained in different ways of being able to develop different things within their community. So now I have time for questions. Thank you very much. There's my information. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. We have a Twitter and we have a Facebook. We also have a YouTube. And then I can share a link with our website. But if you just search for Wahkotowin Law, G of A Law, you'll find our website. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Koren. I lift my hands to the powerful work that you do. I thank you that you've helped me to understand Wahkotowin. I hope I'm saying that right, Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge. I think that's really incredible work. I love the foundation on which it's built from our ancient teachings and value and belief systems. And I appreciate how you brought in the call to action, the number 50. I think that's important as well. So if anyone has any questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can always put it in the chat box as well. In the event you're not cool with coming on video or lending your voice, or maybe your technology doesn't allow, but we'd love to open up the floor for any comments, any questions. I know Sarah Fontaine earlier on in your presentation said traditional law is essential for climate change too. So that's so important.
And we're not just Alberta based, like we do help other communities. We have a meeting with Anishinaabe coming up, and we've been meeting with Wahkotowin. So
awesome. So there's her email information. So if you wanted to take note of that, I believe also this presentation is going to be sent out to all of you who have joined in today's webinar. So you'll have access to that. So any questions, comments? As Sarah just says in the chat box, I loved everything you touched base on today. Very informative, and she will be getting in touch with you. I love when those connections are made. So awesome.
Well, feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you for having me. And it's just another way to think about how we can advance our communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, it doesn't seem that I think you're just giving us a lot to think on, to contemplate on, and we're just wowed by the good work that's happening at the U of A. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you are well. I hope that you are safe wherever you are. I know I got some shoveling to do in my backyard here. So take care, be well, honor your spirit, honor the community that's around you, honor the land, honor the teachings that have been passed on to us. And that's when we become a healthy community. So thank you all for being here with us today, and hopefully we'll see you again. Take care.
Thank you very much. Hi, Sam.